Hi there. After a pretty long delay, I'm going to upload this video, and it's going to be a review for Deadhouse Gates by Steven Erikson. It's the second book in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, but it's the third Malazan book that I've read because after Gardens of the Moon, the first main book, I read kind of the prequel book, which is from the Ian C. Esselmont Malazan novels. And despite what some people will say, because Erikson is quite an act to follow. There's a lot of Esselmont naysayers from what I've seen who would maybe discourage reading Esselmont at all, or interrupting the main sequence with the Esselmont books. I don't recommend skipping them by any means, but there's a lot of value in reading Knight of Knives after Gardens of the Moon and before Deadhouse Gates. And this is going to be a spoiler-free review, but without giving any spoilers, there's maybe 3 or 4 kind of cool things that Knight of Knives builds on or elaborates on, gives some more background about, and it's very useful having that information when you go into Deadhouse Gates. And I think it probably makes it a better book than it would be without having read Knight of Knives first. Of course, I can't really compare the two experiences because I only did one. I can't go back and compare the other possibility. But, take my word for it. And Knight of Knives is only like 300 pages, so compared to these big books, you can hammer through it pretty quick, and I think it's worthwhile. So with that out of the way, let's talk about Deadhouse Gates itself. Now, let's see where to begin here. So, first off, kind of maybe a gutsy kind of move for a big fantasy series like this is how Erikson picks up the story on a different continent in his world, and although it's kind of linking to the overall story that's starting to get constructed back from Gardens of the Moon and Knight of Knives for that matter, you really only get a handful of characters from Gardens of the Moon that carry over into Deadhouse Gates. You get Fiddler from the Bridge Burners, and Callum, the assassin guy from the Bridge Burners, and Apsalar, aka Sorry, the girl who was possessed in the first book, and what's his name, the thief Crocus from the first book as well. So they're kind of like the carryovers. Everything else is new. Fiddler and his kind of team or his posse there, they are one kind of main thread of the story, but all the other stuff is different characters, not explicitly related to many Gardens of the Moon's events. So this is a lot of groundwork being laid out, and basically you're starting fresh in a lot of ways in Deadhouse Gates. But with that being said, Gardens of the Moon was a little tricky because it drops you right in. Deadhouse Gates is kind of similar that way, and it's actually a lot more dense in terms of the fictional lore and the history and the different kind of like what the heck moments or what does this mean moments compared to Gardens of the Moon. It really starts piling that on, and it gets pretty intense to try and keep track of all that. But because you kind of got the foundation and you're learning how the world works from Gardens of the Moon, you have some of the tools to kind of understand things a little better. So on the one hand, it's kind of harder to read than Gardens of the Moon, but it's kind of more satisfying because you're starting to piece things together and understand this very elaborate world that makes up the Malazan story. But they don't, do you any favors. They aren't treating you like an idiot. Like, you really learn things as you go, and you have to kind of puzzle things together. And that's, I think, one of the things that makes the Malazan books pretty interesting. Anyway, in comparison, this is a bigger book. It's probably a third longer than Gardens of the Moon was. And the writing quality just like shoots up quite a lot as well. It's hard to explain why exactly, because I mean, you may know that Gardens of the Moon was written something like 10 years before Deadhouse Gates, because it took a really long time to find a publisher for this kind of book, or this kind of series. And you can tell that some literary grace has improved over those years. Like, the writing in this book is just crazy. From the very first prologue, like, the atmosphere is just intense and dreadful, and Erikson is really quite talented, and definitely one of the top writers for these kinds of big fantasy books. The detail and the pacing is really good, and the way he reveals information is very good, and things that seem like, maybe they're not so important, he brings them together, and you don't really have to necessarily wait too long, although there are some more outstanding, bigger mysteries too, but that's part of what makes it interesting to keep reading the series. Anyway, I would say the main part of this book, well, there's kind of three main parts, actually. So, like I said, Fiddler, who you might remember from the first one, and his crew, they're on kind of a secret mission to cause some problems for the Empire and the Empress, which is all very interesting, but it involves them traveling across this other continent of 7 cities, where there's this big, crazy rebellion breaking out, and the the yoke of the Malazan Empire is being cast off by this big uprising that's happening. So they are, kind of caught up in that, and at the same time as that's going on, there's all these shapeshifters on kind of this quest to find this place, basically, that can help them turn into gods of the shapeshifters. So all around them, there's this uprising going on, and then there's all these shapeshifters kind of warring across the land on their big journey towards trying to become the shapeshifter gods. So they encounter a lot of pretty crazy characters along the way. Some really amazing cinematic moments where they encounter all kinds of crazy adversaries and some interesting allies who have these kind of dark secrets, and wow, so that's one part. It's very interesting on its own. There's this other part where actually Gano's Perrin, if you remember him from the first book, he's kind of like the captain of the bridge burners, and he was the guy with the Lux sword. Anyway, his sister ends up getting kind of mixed up in the Auditaral mines as sort of a slave, basically, of the Empire. And then it's kind of her travails with her the characters in her orbit, and what goes on with them as this uprising starts happening, from their perspective as slaves in this mine. And they end up going through all kinds of stuff. It's very interesting. Probably the core, most powerful part of the book, though, definitely an emotional journey, is the story of Coltane, and he's kind of the Malazan military leader who gets tasked to protect these Malaz refugees as they kind of flee the rebellion and try and get across the countryside to one of the last cities still held by the Malazan forces. That makes up a good part of the book, and if it sounds like I'm maybe spoiling something, don't worry about it too much. I mean, the back of the book kind of tells you that's what it is. this commander leading his troops to save 30,000 refugees. Big running battle. I mean, it says it on the back, so you know that's going to be a big part of it. Also on the map, there's two maps kind of showing the march, so unless you don't look at the maps because you're afraid of spoilers, like you kind of know that's what's going to happen. And man, that story is intense. Way higher emotionally intense story than anything in Gardens of the Moon, and it's really a roller coaster, which is kind of a corny cliche, but wow, like big ups and downs of victory and despair. And a friend of mine was pointing out he didn't think any fantasy story had really done a story like that, where kind of in a fantasy setting, you have this big chain of dogs, as it's called, this um, big march of refugees going from one place to another and fighting battle after battle after battle along the way, and different challenges, and it's so awesome. Like, I really think Deadhouse Gates stepped things up a lot, and a lot of it is not only setting the foundation on a lot of different stuff that's going to become important later, and not only with Felison's story in the mines, and then Fiddler and his team's story with their situation, but this Coltane story is just so well done. First of all, Coltane is the coolest character so far. He's just you never really get his point of view. It's always looking at his situation from other people's point of view. But he's just a really cool character. Really gets you pumped up. You want him to win. You're emotionally invested, and you're always thinking, oh, how is he going to do this next? Because Erikson does a really good job raising the stakes in all these as this story goes on. Basically, for the chain of dogs, even from the very first big battle they deal with, it's like, oh, here's the situation, we're screwed, like there's no way we can get out of it. So as a reader, you're early-ish in the book, and you think, oh, well, I presume they're going to get out of it. What are they going to do against these hopeless odds? And then it's just sequence after sequence like that, and like, oh, we got out of this situation that we thought was impossible. Well, this situation coming up is even more impossible. How are we going to get out of this? And you just can't believe the tension and the suspense and all these different situations that are set up, where it's really quite interesting, like the battle set pieces. And very good military fantasy and battles, and the tactics they seem believable in terms of what can turn the tide of the struggle and the battle situations going on. And then just crushing moments where everything seems hopeless, and they have huge setbacks, and yet the journey still has to go on, and so many more challenges to come. And it's just a slog on the one hand. Like, you really feel this army and the burden of carrying these refugees, and people are dying, and they're getting picked off by these attacks, and big battles make them lose huge numbers, and they keep going from one crazy challenge to another. And just the heroic stubbornness and the courage of the leaders, when so many people are like, it's hopeless, it's hopeless. It's all really, really well done. If you were to strip out all the content of the book, other than that, it could be a very good standalone war fantasy story, kind of like Legend by David Gemmell, like the story of like the ill-fated siege of the ancient fortress in that great book. You could probably do that like this. It would be a great movie or a great novel by itself, but because it's tied in with all these other crazy things as part of the big Malazan saga that's being woven here, it just elevates it to this huge level. So, I mean, personally, I loved Gardens of the Moon. Top notch, very good introduction. And a lot of people would say, you know, Deadhouse Gates is a lot better. I agree with that. And here's where maybe I disagree, though. Some people would say if you didn't like Gardens of the Moon, try Deadhouse Gates, and you know that might change your opinion and make you want to read more. I kind of find it hard to imagine that if you didn't like Gardens of the Moon, you would still like this. Although I can see how it's possible, but it almost amplifies Gardens of the Moon like up 5 or 10 times in terms of you know, things. If you didn't like it about Gardens of the Moon, you might be extra annoyed here. But I mean, who knows? Just keep that in mind, what people say. You could have a good result if you do that. But honestly, I wouldn't be too optimistic that you would like this if Gardens of the Moon wasn't your cup of tea. Although again, Chain of Dogs, which is a good solid chunk of this book by itself, is a pretty amazing story. And again, roller coasters. You go through the highs and lows of victory and defeat, and it's just crazy. Right up to the final chapters where you just are begging for relief from the tension. You want victory, and it's just such a struggle and such cost. And wow, really incredible ending. Some soul-shattering moments, and you kind of almost, without spoiling anything, there's some stuff near the later part of the story, and it's just crushing. You feel like garbage, but then Erikson does a really good job ending on a really hopeful, inspiring, like fist in the air kind of moment, right down to the last page. It's like, you know, if you feel like crap reading this book after this major violent slog and all the craziness, just let me tell you, the epilogue will, you know, raise your spirits in a very, very cool way, and it'll be hard not to be like, "Ah!" If you know what I mean. So, I guess I don't have too much else to say, but I do want to get back and review Gardens of the Moon, so I'll try to do that. I'm coming up on the end of Memories of Ice, which is incredible, so I would like to do a review of that one too. But you know, I'd give this definitely highest recommendation, as you know, a standalone book, kind of whatever. If you could cut out the Chain of Dogs part, that would be a good story. But as a part of the Malazan, it's a big step up in quality, big step up in storytelling. The lore is extremely interesting. So many cool moments, so many cool battles, so much intrigue, so many interesting conversations that shed light on different things that you've read about before. And just the promise of so many crazy things that are hinted at or touched upon in this book that you know are going to become big things later on, but you're not sure how. You just know it's going to be crazy. Well, I guess that's it. This series is awesome. You really should read it if you're into epic fantasy. I'm just a few books in now, but loving it. Deadhouse Gates, highest recommendation. You want to get through Gardens of the Moon and Night of Knives, because honestly, as good as those books were, I think Deadhouse Gates is where this series really starts getting crazy and really gives you an idea of what you might be in store for as you read this series further. Well, shoot, that is kind of a long review, but thanks for hanging in there, and I'll see you next time for the next little book review. And yeah, I hope you like Deadhouse Gates if you end up starting Malazan and get to the second Book of the Fallen book. It's amazing. Take care.